Okay, good evening, everybody, once again. Welcome to the most recent, I'm told, the 17th installment of Building the Scottish State. I have the great pleasure to have with me James Kelly, who is the director of the Scott Goes Pop website, very highly regarded, which does a lot of, has commissioned quite a bit of polling, particularly recently over Scottish independence. And so we're here to talk about that and the broader independence movement as we go forward. So first of all, James, thanks for joining us this evening.
No problem. Good to be here.
Good. So just tell us a little bit about, your blog, what you've been doing. I was relatively unfamiliar with what you were doing before, but, just tell us about kind of how you got, because I looked on your blog and you started back in 2007 or 2008. Is that right?
Yeah, it was 2008.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. It was just a sort of amateur doing something for fun to begin with, and it just I think as the to begin with, it was like a few dozen readers per day at most, and then it kind of took off around about 2013 because of obviously the independence referendum, and I was writing a lot about opinion polls, and then it sort of suddenly took off, and it was getting thousands of readers rather than dozens. So it was a very sudden change after 5 years of just talking to one man and a dog sort of thing.
Okay. And tell me a little bit about how it's evolved. I mean, you say it started out very small, and I mean, have you always mostly focused on polling and support for independence, or what kind of other directions, or how is the site evolved over the more than God,
yeah, I mean, I suppose I just started out as I suppose I just sort of started out as general political commentary, and it just sort of developed into talking about polls, because I've always been interested in polls, and I suppose during the sort of long run up to the independence referendum, I spent an awful lot of time looking at the detailed results of polls, trying to convince myself they weren't as bad as they appeared at first glance, and I was sort of trying to see signs of hope. And I suppose when you spend a lot of time sort of thinking about that anyway, you might as well write down your thoughts, and so that's what I was kind of doing, and it just sort of went from there. And also, it seemed to me that the polls were not always that bad. In the around about 2013, there were a lot of panel-based polls that were reasonably good for yes. Mm-hmm. I mean, they didn't have yes in the lead, but they showed that yes were not that far behind, and but those were sort of tending to get ignored, and the media were focusing on the bad polls and sort of suggesting that meant that no was out of sight, and it was just a foregone conclusion. So it seemed to me what was missing was a poll of polls, which is a common thing in the media, but it wasn't being run at that time to sort
really? Okay. Because I know Nate Silver did that in the United States, but yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I mean, like back in the day when I was growing up, on the 9 o'clock news on the BBC during election campaigns, they would finish with a poll of polls to show you what was going on. But there was nothing like that happening at the time. So I started my own poll of polls to try and put things in perspective, and to show that when a single bad poll came out, it wasn't necessarily that it was that bad. It was more. It was possible that it was just a kind of house effect of the individual company, and that the average position maybe wasn't as bad as it appeared from the hysterical headlines in the unionist media.
No, exactly. I just remember a review, because you may know I wrote for Newsnet Scotland between 2012 and 2014, and so I was always just going through the news saying, "Oh, blow for Alex Salmond, his dreams are sunk," and all that.
Yeah.
I don't know, it's 40, 60, it's moving up, so it's just the interesting the way it's interpreted, to say the least. And tell me a little bit about the techniques, as I understand it. I don't know whether, with panel-based that you've worked, whether others, how they work, but I've heard that a lot of times they poll people that are, that are regular contributors, and then they may be more, and they be asked many questions. They may be asked about, I don't know, soap or, bread, or I don't know, a lot of stuff. And then the whoever's sponsoring the poll or pays for it pays the company to include, things about Scottish independence or what have you in the question, so that they're kind of, killing several birds with one stone, but they're usually the same group of people, that are I don't know if they get paid or what, I don't know.
Yeah, they do. Yeah.
But tell me about what you know about the polling techniques, particularly with panel based that you've worked with.
Well, most polls these days are conducted in the way you suggested, which is by an online panel, people who have put themselves forward to be polled regularly, and so they're being polled again and again and again. So I mean, when online polling started, the general consensus was that this wouldn't work because it sort of went against the general principle of polling, which is you get a new random sample each time. Whereas if you're just polling the same people again and again and again, there's going to be an effect from that because they're no longer a representative sample because you've changed them by polling them so often, if you know what I mean. Simply by asking them the question 10 times, they're going to have thought about it more than the average person. So it shouldn't work. Online polling should not work, but I suppose it's been found through trial and error that for whatever reason it can produce relatively accurate results. And sometimes, I mean, and at the time of the independence referendum, we still assumed that probably telephone polling was more reliable, was more accurate. But there was a sort of change of attitude around about 2 years later at the time of the Brexit referendum when online polling actually had a better record. So if anything, the perception now is, well, either that online is superior or it's no longer as clear whether online or telephone is superior, even though really online should be inferior to telephone polling.
But how many people put themselves forward to do and are people paid to give their opinion? I mean, when they put themselves forward, for example, for telephone, are they paid somewhat, or how does that work?
I've only been interviewed for a telephone poll once in my life, and I wasn't paid for it. But people who put themselves forward for online polling do get paid a small amount, so it's typically 50 pence for every survey, or it might be a bit more than that if it's an extremely long survey. So they get a little bit of reward to give them an incentive to do it, but it's not huge.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And I've watched a lot of kind of Noam Chomsky videos about manufacturing consent and the way that the idea that if that from a cynical point of view, that public opinion polling is more about influencing public opinion than it is actually reflecting it. And we can see that at least to some extent in the way that, of course, the way that, they had the screaming headlines about how, support has tanked or this or that. How do you see it? I mean, because, if people are looking and they say, oh, the polls are still behind, then, obviously that's going to affect people's opinion. And I live in France and polls are banned, within a certain period before the election. They have very strict rules on that, for that very purpose. But I mean, you can't even think about doing that in the United States or the UK. Just in your own view, how, to the extent both that public opinion polls both reflect it, but also may have a very heavy influence on public opinion as well.
Well, that was certainly what I was concerned about during the independence referendum, because I felt like it was sort of the sense that, well, it was kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. The unionist media were promoting these polls that were showing very bad results for yes, and it was like a way of sucking the life out of the campaign, I felt, because sucking all the excitement out. We all already know this. Why are we bothering with this? It's that kind of thing. And I really felt that was a sort of very dangerous thing. And yet, in spite of that sense, the sort of the consensus, and I know there was a consensus among journalists that no was going to win, months, years before the referendum. In spite of that, we still had the huge swing to yes, which is maybe.
And I would argue they helped engineer that. I mean, if the BBC or others had a completely different attitude on, and John Robertson, as you know, has done good work on this, that we got in Newsnet, and the way that the news is presented, it may kind of quantitatively be balanced in terms of good or bad independent stories, but it's always the way it's presented. Bad news. The lead headline. Scotland screwed, and then maybe they say, oh well, maybe there's a little old lady that said something nice about it at the end of the show. I mean, that's kind of like a caricature, but you get the the idea. And I think in my view, it wasn't. From a press point of view, it was engineered that way. And that was a very deliberate effort to bring down enthusiasm, bring down the vote, so that no would prevail. To what extent do you see the media's role as being, well, at least pernicious towards the Yes campaign back in 2014?
Well, just to talk about the relationship between the polls and what you're talking about, of course. The BBC at network level were not really paying that much attention. They were sort of going through the motions a bit until 10 days before the independence referendum when the YouGov poll came out showing yes ahead for the first time. And then sort of all hell broke loose, and it was like a sort of shock and awe campaign from the BBC for about a week. And it was, I think anybody, I mean, the BBC's defenders will deny this, but I've spoken to people who are not particularly pro-independence who just said, it was so blatant for that week. It was so blatant. It was almost laughable what the BBC were doing, and so that YouGov poll, I suppose, in retrospect, worked against us because the network BBC weren't paying much attention to that point, and then suddenly they came all guns blazing with a scare story after scare story after scare story,
and the vow. We can't forget the vow.
Well, that came eventually, but that was the week after. But I mean. It definitely had an effect that week. That pummeling that the BBC gave us, it definitely had an effect, and you could see the swing back in the polls. We were in a good position, and then it sort of swung back again.
And do you think that? And what do you see, given that? And what do you see as the possibility? I mean, I'm just kind of game theorizing here, but if there is a, if the SNP do win a very overwhelming majority, and they say, okay, we're going to have a referendum, with or without Boris Johnson's permission, it'll be legal because it'll be legislated upon by the Scottish Parliament. They can take us to court if they want. I mean, do you see it being any different at this time around, or is it going to be even more intense? What are your predictions if you want to take out a crystal ball?
I'm trying to work out what the BBC would do. I think there's got to be a bit of a sore spot for them that they came under so much criticism the last time, and can they be as bad as they were? I mean, they're not going to give us a fair crack of the whip. They're not going to give us a fair crack of the whip, that's for sure. But are they going to be as bad? Maybe not. Maybe not. And also, I think it's a slightly different situation of when.
Well, absolutely, yes, yeah.
If Yes go in the leads, I think that makes it harder for them to be so cynical and relentlessly negative. I mean, it's hard when you're dealing with something which at the moment, maybe not by the end of the campaign, but at the moment is the majority view of the people of Scotland. It's hard to just be so dismissive and so cynical and so almost bitter about it. There was a kind of degree of bitterness, and I think in the London part of the BBC, just the idea of Scottish independence. What is this? It was that kind of attitude.
Well, it demonstrated a complete lack of understanding about Scots, and it was. But I'm wondering, is it just because they, want to? Is it just because they want to preserve the Union, or they just don't understand Scots, or probably a combination of both? I mean, and the way that they were always talking Scotland down. Oh, the oil's running out. You won't be able to use the pound. What money will you use? I mean, all these absurd, threats or whatever. But and just almost nothing. Nothing positive to say, because I don't think they do have that much positive case now for maintaining the Union. Do you think that they'll even attempt to make a positive case?
One thing I was going to say, actually, it just occurred to me, I've thought about this before. If I ever ran a poll in the rest of the UK, one question I'd like to ask people who live in the rest of the UK or in England is, have you ever visited Scotland? Because one of the problems is, I mean, if you compare it to like the Quebec situation in Canada, I would imagine most Canadians have been to Quebec because it's a central province. It's kind of, but we're geographically peripheral. And just in terms of the lack of understanding of Scotland, I would imagine that an awful lot of people in England have never been here, have never even been close to here. I raised this point once, and they said, well, we've all been to the Edinburgh Festival, James. Well, sort of like middle class, but all right. So maybe the second question was, have you ever been to Scotland that's not been part of it when it's not been the Edinburgh Festival? Because anybody who's been to the Edinburgh Festival knows that it's not particularly like Scotland when you're there. So it's, I don't know how much understanding there is. I think we seem like a sort of faraway peripheral place. It's probably, I'm sure far more people have been to France or to Belgium or to the Netherlands than have been to Scotland.
Okay. And so tell me about the poll. So you've had, 4 polls conducted over the past year or so?
4.
Okay. So they were crowdfunded and they were all with panel base, is that correct?
No, the first 3 were with panel base. So the 3 last year were with panel base. So I contacted panel base again this year in the hope of, the one I just run. I was hoping to do that with panel base again. But they, for contractual reasons, they couldn't do it. They had an arrangement with somebody else. So I went with Servation instead, which made me nervous because I mean there were a limited number of options. So once panel-based were not possible, there was a limited number of options. But I was worried about going with Servation because they haven't been as good for yes as panel-based have been recently.
Okay.
So I was nervous about that, and sure enough, it came back with a lower yes lead than the panel-based polls have been showing.
Because the panel-based were what? So tell me about the results in each one, in the ones that you've seen. First of all, they all measured in excess of 50% support for yes.
Yeah. So I mean, the idea last January was obviously the general election was in December 2019, and so I think most people would have naturally expected. You get a general election which makes Brexit inevitable, and you get an SNP landslide victory. Surely the logical thing to do, some newspaper, some broadcaster is going to run an opinion poll to see what effect this huge event, this huge election result is going to have had on public opinion on independence. But of course, the media don't care about that. So several weeks went past without any poll on independence. It seemed logical that probably support for yes would have increased, but nobody knew. So eventually, in discussion with others, I decided to crowdfund one, and it came back. By the time I actually got it done, there actually had been other polls by then, but by the time when it came out, it was 52% for yes, which was the highest since just after the EU referendum in 2016. So that was in January, obviously, as the pandemic was starting in China, but it hadn't reached these shores yet. And so, I suppose the crisis really started in March. And so I think most people would have assumed at that point that, certainly I assumed that this was the yes lead that had just been built up was now going to disappear, because in times of crisis, people are not going to want to even entertain the thought of a major constitutional upheaval. And sure enough, the first couple of polls round about the start of the pandemic did show that it had moved back the other way, and it was level or no was in a slight lead. But then the Dominic Cummings episode happened, when Dominic Cummings made his famous trip to Barnard Castle to test his eyesight, and so somebody said to me, "Well, why don't you run a poll now just to see if this has changed anything?" So yeah, I did, and that was in early June. And so that was the first poll that showed that the pandemic had pushed yes back into the lead. So it was back to 52%, exactly where it was in January. But that was the first poll that showed that the pandemic.
So was it 52 that it kind of went down a bit as the world was descending into this pandemic, and then once the whole Dominic Cummings things went in, then it edged back up. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So that was so that poll I ran in June. That was the first of this sequence, the first of the 20 in a row, which has shown yes in the lead. So that was the one in June, and then I ran one in November as well. I mean, by that time in other polls, the yes lead had crept up a bit. So in panel-based polls run by other people, commissioned by other people, I should say, it had crept up to 54% and then to 55%. And then in the poll I commissioned in November, it reached 56%, which was an all-time high with panel-based. So that was good. And around about the same time, other polls, there was a Savanta Comrades poll that had yes on 58%. Ipsos Mori had yes on 58% and then on 56%. So there was some very, very unprecedented high numbers for yes at that stage. And then, well, in the new year, obviously, the end of the Brexit transition period, so that seemed a logical time to run another one. So I commissioned the one from Servation. But it's not directly comparable with the previous polls because it's a different company, and this one showed 51 yes, 49 no.
Okay.
Which was only a touchdown in the previous comparable poll, which obviously was a Servation poll, so it was only a 1% decrease. So it's hard to compare with the ones last year.
Exactly, and from what you understand, is there a different method? Are there differences in methodology between what you said? Comres was it? And Servation and panel based. Do you, from what you understand, are there different methodologies employed?
Well, nothing sort of fundamental. They're all Comres, Servation, panel-based. They all use volunteer online panels. But I mean, there has been a difference, because I think, like 2 years ago, if you'd asked me, I would have said Servation are better for yes than panel base, because at that point panel base was consistently showing really poor results for yes, and Servation were a little bit better. I think the change happened after the 2019 election, because all pollsters would have updated their methodology, their weighting, to take into account the result of the 2019 election. And for some reason, that swung things around, and now panel base are a bit more favourable for yes and Servation are, but it's not entirely clear why. I'm not actually sure why that's the case, but it's just obvious that consistently the panel base average for yes over the last year has been like 2% higher or something like that than Servation.
Okay. Let's see. And what other questions do you ask besides the just support for independence? Have you done more? I mean, have you asked other questions as well?
Yeah. So with each poll, I've asked like 5, 6, 7, 8 supplementary questions as well. So obviously last January, it was just after the first phase of Brexit. So I was trying to find out if Brexit had, public reaction to Brexit, whether people thought that made the case for an independence referendum because we'd been taken out of the EU against our will, and whether it's increased support for independence, so that kind of thing. Each time I've run the poll, I've added a question about Plan B. Just to see if we could demonstrate public support for the various Plan B options, and because obviously the SNP leadership are extremely cautious about anything like that. And if you could get a positive poll result, maybe hopefully puts a little bit of pressure on them, or makes them less nervous about maybe perhaps even doing what they would like to do, but they're just too scared to do. I don't really know what their own instincts are, but for whatever reason they're very reluctant to go down that road. So the one in January showed support for the Plan B option of, what they're talking about now, what Mike Russell is talking about now, of legislating for a referendum without a Section 30 order, and then just sitting back and saying, if the UK government wants to challenge it, okay, go to the courts and we'll see the outcome. So the poll in June, I then moved to the other Plan B option, which is the one talked about by Angus McNeill, which is to use an election to double as a referendum, so that there's no question of legal challenge, because nobody can do anything about that. And I should first of all say that the one in January produced a positive result for the legislating for a referendum idea, and the one in June also produced a positive result for using an election to double as a referendum.
And is it basically the same percentage as support for independence? I mean, is there any disparity between the support for a Plan B and just support for independence?
It's been different numbers each time, but I think from memory, it's the support for Plan B has tended to be greater than the support for independence. I think that's been the case.
That's interesting. When you read these polls that you've been reading for more than a decade now, what do you understand? What do you understand about the Scots psyche in terms of independence? I mean, for me, I remember visiting Scotland in the early 90s or even before, and spending time with my uncle and aunt in Govan, and politics was just such a horrible thing. It was, and then they just didn't want to talk about it. They just see these bastards in Westminster, braying and just being awful, and it's just like they didn't want to know about it. And it was the same when I came in the early 90s. People would just, the only time they would talk about politics is after a few whiskeys, raging about how they're taking our oil and stuff like that. And but certainly, since then, it's been a big sea change, and obviously people are speaking more about it. But it kind of, in my view, the way it was always the kind of the Margot MacDonald, too wee, too poor, too stupid kind of thing, and the way that the Scots were perceived, and they felt that cringe. And maybe, I kind of, when I first got interested in 2011 in the referendum, I felt like, it's a no-brainer. Of course you want to be independent. I mean, why would you want to stick around with Westminster? I mean, it's just absurd. And then I start, writing for Newsnet and stuff, like, wow, people really are resistant to it. And I just didn't understand it. And I understand better now. But I was wondering, just in the polls, what you see as the kind of principal reticences or reluctances of Scots
I've lost you.
To openly embrace independence.
I lost you a little bit at the end there. Could you repeat the final?
I was just wondering, I was describing how I'd seen the evolution of Scott's thinking towards independence. And then, as I said, when I started, getting involved in 2011, writing for Newsnet, et cetera, I couldn't understand why Scots would not embrace independence. Like, of course, you get away from Westminster, you get your oil revenues. I mean, you can do what you want. And I just didn't understand why everybody wasn't voting for independence. And then, I came here, I spent more time here, and I learned more about kind of the Scots psyche. But what do you see? What do you see as, is it just fear? Is it the scare stories of what, what'll your economy will be a basket case without the UK, you need the broad shoulders? I know it's kind of a vague question, but what do you see in the polling that you've commissioned and you observed? What does that reflect about the Scots psyche in your view?
Well, I don't think there's much doubt that fear won the referendum for the no campaign. I don't think they would have won without the scare stories. I think what's interesting is what has changed the situation. Why have we got the sustained yes lead? And I think the explanation really is, for the first time since like maybe the Jacobite uprising of 1745, Scotland during the pandemic has kind of been a self-governing country. On the things that matter, it's been Nicola Sturgeon in charge, and people have noticed that Nicola Sturgeon is in charge, and people think she's doing it well. And they look at what Boris Johnson is like in London, and they're making a comparison, and they're seeing, for the first time, it's twigged, an independent Scotland would probably be better governed than the United Kingdom currently is. And I think that's what's changed. And I don't think that's occurred to people before, because I don't think people have looked at Scotland and said, I could really visualize what Scotland would be like as a self-governing country, and now we're actually living it. We're not completely independent, but on the things that matter, Nicola Sturgeon is in charge, and people are watching that, and they can see what it's like.
Okay, all right. Maybe get a few of the questions. Let's see. Jock Gibson, what does Scott Goes Pop think of pop-up parties?
Well,
I guess he's referring to the IF Independence for Scotland Party and these other ones that. And first of all, do you know the status of those? Are there going to be at least list parties, that are other than the SNP and the Greens? Do you? I think that there's some are registered, but I was just wondering if you knew anything about their actual status where they can run. I saw George Galloway tried to register some party, but he didn't do the paperwork right.
Yeah, so the name was rejected or something, I think.
Yeah.
I think I haven't really been following it in great detail. I remember reading that I think IFS has been successfully registered, and I remember them making the point that their main rival, the Judean People's Front of Judea, had not successfully registered, and so it was a bit pointless for the other party to try and get IFS to stand down, because only the IFS had successfully registered. And so they were saying, why don't you stand down in favour of us? Because we're the ones that have been registered. So I don't know what the status of all of them is, but I'm sure there will be fringe parties. And well, my view of Independence for Scotland, the party, is that I'm sure it's well-meaning, but I think they're going to get a derisory number of votes, and so either it will have no effect at all, or it will take votes away from other parties that could win seats, other pro-independence parties that could win seats, and it might have a sort of mildly negative effect. Probably not going to change that much, because it's probably talking about a relatively small number of votes. The only exception to that would be, if Alex Salmond is still thinking of setting up a party, he might be timed out. He might not have enough time to get the registration through, so I suppose theoretically he might join one that already exists, either take it over or become a sort of symbolic figurehead. And then obviously the situation would change. And if that was IFS that was in that situation, then suddenly it would become a credible party. But
I don't see that happening before the election, that's for sure. But anyway, okay. And do you think that the new pop-up parties who are in the running for Hollywood have left it too late to compete with the SNP? I think you sort of answered that question before, that you thought that they would be just get a marginal number of votes.
Yeah.
Do you know if have there actually been polls conducted that would ask, like, would you vote for on the list seats? Would you vote for? I mean, have you seen any polling on that?
No.
Okay.
No, they haven't added IFS as an option in any of the polls, as far as I'm aware.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Anna McConnell, how many people are involved in each poll, and does volume make much difference?
So typically 1,000. Sometimes it might be 2,000. So obviously, the more people, the more accurate it's likely to be. But I think the feeling is once you get to 1,000, it's reliable and it's not going to improve dramatically if you go higher than that. So 1,000 is enough.
Okay. All right. I'll take this one. Bob Matheson, I believe that the digital covenant is the simplest, most direct route to independence. I don't know if you've heard of that, but I've actually was involved in developing this. And it was basically, it's a digital covenant that where you sign it, you're registered on the blockchain. And in theory, it could accurately measure support for independence if there were to be 2.2 million plus signatures. And the site is very well constructed, extremely well done. We worked very hard on it, but we asked for, basically we sent a letter to the Scottish Parliament, saying, look, this is a verifiable, measurable way to measure public opinion. Here you can use it. You can use it to measure support for independence. But the Scottish government wanted nothing to do with it. They only wanted, referendum route. And under the logic, which I guess is understandable, is that they want international recognition. If they were to say, oh yeah, we got this covenant, and, the French would say, what is, the people wouldn't recognize it, even though it is, it is a very valid way of measuring it. And even if it's not very likely not going to be accepted as the means for independence, but at the same time, we're building a blockchain infrastructure which can be used for voting, for measuring public opinion after. So, I hope at the very least it serves as that. Let me just finish it up because this is up my lane. Let's see. Do you think signing and putting people off, as it seems not to work very well in my own experiences? It's a very rigorous process. We want it to be completely verifiable. So you had to have a clear picture of both. And so, maybe there were some problems in that regard. Bob, I agree with you. But we didn't get the support of, although we've gotten a fair amount of support from people who think it is a valid reason. We did not get the input of the Scottish government, and they have their own, their mentality of how they want to take care of it, how they want to achieve independence. And so, okay. All right. Okay. And how do you see the future of voting? And do you think that, I don't know how much you've, read or learned about blockchain, but from what I understand, it's a very, very good way of measuring public opinion that could, in theory, take the place of polling. Do you have any view on that, of how, blockchain can be used for democratic purposes?
I don't know anything about blockchain.
Okay.
But I would imagine, I do imagine that electronic voting is the future. I would imagine, in years to come, there'll be a sort of window of opportunity to just casually go online and cast your vote. And I would imagine at that point also you could make voting compulsory, because
sure.
At that point it's just not that inconvenient to do it. So why wouldn't you just make it compulsory? So that would sort of solve the problem.
Just as easy as possible. Because the way I see it, this is based especially on my experience in the United States and following it very carefully, because that's what I teach. But the way that they make it so difficult to vote, over the past 10 years. You've had a group called ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council, which is a massive lobbying, basically a massive lobbying group that is able to write the laws in different states. And especially in Republican-run states, they've made it much more difficult to vote, to register. They purge the lists. All these challenges that you heard about over the last few weeks in the presidential election. In my view, just register everybody for life. And be done with it. Why should people have to re-register each time before they vote? Unless but basically what blockchain is it's a digital ledger. So you make and it's unhackable. So it's secret in the same way that voting is, paper voting is secret. But it can't. But it's electronic, and so you record something in the ledger, in the digital ledger. And then it can't be hacked because of the the encryption in it. One block cannot be hacked without all of the other blocks being hacked as well, and everybody knowing about it. So it's basically foolproof in terms of, measuring and recording information. And so if this had been embraced by the Scottish government, people could have just signed. Their signature is recorded in perpetuity, and then and also you can check on what to make sure that your vote or your signature was properly counted. You can be absolutely sure that your identity is solid, and so you can have it can be a platform for self-sovereign identity, which allows for more digital privacy, etc. So it's I hope that the Scottish government does embrace this for the future, and that there is electronic voting. And as you say, it doesn't even have to be compulsory, just easy, just get on your phone.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah,
that's it. It doesn't have to be. But and just make it easy, because in the elections, at least in 2016, in 2018, you had people standing in line for 8 hours. And they would move around the polling stations and say, oh, it's there. Oh, no, it's there. And then you'd have lines of 8 hours, and it's just absurd. Why not just be able to do it on your phone? So I hope that is the future.
Well, I'm an American citizen, so I vote in U.S. elections, and what makes it completely alien experience from this country is the sheer number of votes you have to cast. So that's why there's so much queuing, I would imagine, because it must take people about an hour to just complete the form. It's like you have to cast about 30 votes.
Which state do you vote in?
Vermont.
Vermont. Okay, yeah, because I did vote in Maryland when I did, but my mom's moved away and they want an ID now, so I'm just I didn't bother to register. I don't even know if I could. But yeah, I remember getting the ballots back for Obama and all those. It's like 4 or 5 pages.
Yeah.
And then it's not only the president; it's the president, maybe the senator, definitely the representative. It might be the city council. It might be the dog catcher. It might be several ballot initiatives. It's just absurd.
Yeah.
Here in France, you just go and you take a piece of paper, put it in an envelope for a party or for a candidate. That's it.
Yeah.
And you have different. Of course, you have presidential elections, two rounds, legislative elections, 2 rounds. And you're only voting for one office.
Yeah.
Rather than because even the most informed voter in the United States, and you read all up the candidates, you get the League of Women Voters stuff and all that. It's almost impossible to be well informed.
Yeah.
These candidates anyway, so it could be made so much simpler. Yeah. And what are your own? How long did you live in the United States? Or
I've never lived there.
Okay. All right. And let's see. And so what do you think are the things that could drive the support for independence even further? How do you see this going forward? Okay, we're in the middle of a pandemic. Hopefully there'll be an election, in May for the Scottish election. You have, Boris Johnson saying no, but then you also, but you see independence rising. It probably rose a few points today with him coming here, but he might completely refuse. And then you might have the other parties boycotting it, which could underline the legitimacy. How do you see it? Because I've interviewed Ian Blackford and others who and Pete Wishart, who just say, oh no, it'll be okay. We just need to build support for independence and it'll happen, and that the increased polling would have an effect on Boris Johnson to eventually cede. But then I talked to Angus McNeil. He's saying, Boris Johnson's never going to allow it. Just forget it. So how do you see it? It's completely speculative, but I'd be interested in hearing your views.
Well, I suppose I'm somewhere in between the two, in the sense that I don't think it's completely impossible that the Tories might eventually grant a Section 30 order. I think it's unlikely, but I don't think it's completely impossible. You could maybe see a tactical reason in the end why they might do it. But I think Angus McNeil is closer to the truth, and it's obviously not the case, as Pete Wishart says. It's obviously not true to say that rising support for independence makes it more likely that Boris Johnson will grant a Section 30 order. Self-evidently, the higher the support for independence gets, the less likely it is that Boris Johnson is going to grant a Section 30 order, because he's more likely to lose the referendum. The reason David Cameron granted a Section 30 order was because he thought he knew it was safe to do so. Mm-hmm. So the higher the support for independence gets, the more likely delaying tactics or just flat refusals. Pete Wishart is wrong. There is not going to be a point where it becomes unsustainable for Boris Johnson to to refuse the Section 30 order, we are going to have to take radical action probably to make something happen.
Okay. All right. I'm a Labor no voter and open to voting for independence next time. What can the Yes movement do to attract more soft no's like myself? It's very positive. Thank you, DAR. Appreciate it. What do you think? And given the polling that you've seen, yeah, here's how I want to frame the question. As we've seen, a lot of people are reluctant because they've accepted the scare stories. They can't use the pound. They can't, they won't be able to do this. They won't be able to do that. However, since 2014 and especially since 2016, Scotland has seen them coming out, being removed, without their, being taken out of the EU without their will. And as you very rightly pointed out, seeing Nicola Sturgeon act much more competently than Boris Johnson and seeing what actual self-governance could look like. What are some of the other fears that you perceive that could be, that could be alleviated so that more people would vote no, that people would vote yes by, what could the SNP advance to reassure soft no voters into voting yes?
There are so many fears that people have. Some of them are, people worry about losing their favorite television programs, and I think a lot of these things are irrational, but because people haven't been to the Republic of Ireland perhaps to see what an independent country that used to be part of the UK looks like. It's just. I think it's just reassurance. I remember when I became converted to independence. I can remember when it happened. I was watching a sort of phone-in program with Alex Salmond in the 1990s during a general election campaign, and it was just one of those programs where he got lots of time to speak, and he just developed the ideas, and he just sort of set out logically.
I've seen that. I think I've seen the clip that you're talking about.
Yeah, so he just sort of set out what an independent Scotland would look like, and he wasn't being constantly interrupted. He just had lots of time to develop each point, and he was saying, well, I mean, an independent Scotland is not, if you don't like the SNP, an independent Scotland is not going to just be run by the SNP automatically. We are actually going to have democratic elections, and if you want a Labour government, if you want John Smith to be Prime Minister of Scotland, you can have that. And he was answering questions about Shetland, and he just sort of went through everything, and it sort of was like one by one my sort of objections ran out. So I mean, I think it's just a sort of process of reassurance. I think a lot of the scare stories are not going to have as much punch this time, obviously because of the EU situation and. An independent Scotland. I mean, probably what the argument will be is that an independent Scotland will not get back into the EU. So I think a lot of it will hinge on whether people believe that. It's not true. An independent Scotland would get back into the EU because there's such an obvious incentive for the EU to allow us back. But the no campaign, if there is a no campaign, they will put a lot of emphasis on, but you don't know that Scotland will get back into the EU. And so if people believe that, we might have a problem. But if they're confident we'll get back into the EU, then it's easier to argue that Scotland might have a brighter economic future as an independent country because we'd have access to the EU single market.
Oh, absolutely, and I've been thinking about this for quite several years now. And in my view, I know that Sturgeon has met with Michel Barnier and Juncker back in the day. And I know that they still have communication with him. I know Alan Smith was in when he was in the EU Parliament was in very good standing. He made his beautiful do not let Scotland down things. And so there's no question there's a lot of goodwill. And I'm just wondering, at this point, just very post real Brexit, if at some point Scotland, the Scottish government says we're going to have a referendum. And then the EU says, and we will recognize that, and you can come join us if you do. But because as you rightly point out, well basically after this, the UK, the EU has no interest in safeguarding the UK's interest because they're out. So and they have every incentive to have Scotland in because of the fishing waters, because of the wind energy, whiskey, everything, and they don't want to lose anybody. So, you know, as you say, it's very much in the interest in it. Let's see, but I mean, I'm just wondering if maybe they have some deal cooked up where when they announce a referendum, that the EU will say, yeah, you can stay. If you become independent, you can stay. You can come right back in. You know, do you think anything like that's possible?
Well, I think the EU could certainly make positive noises. I don't think they could make a sort of firm commitment that Scotland could come back in, but I think they're probably, they're certainly not going to be as negative as they were last time when Barroso went on the Andrew Marr show and said, Scotland won't get back in, and it was obviously hand in glove with Cameron on that. So they don't have any incentive to help the UK government this time. So we might see a few positive noises that it's probably not going to be that difficult for Scotland to get in. I don't think they'll make a firm commitment, no.
Okay. Donald Somerville, do you think the difficulty in converting no voters is that Indie voters are perceived as too left-wing? My own view is that Scotland is definitely left of center, just generally speaking. You do have some, of course, you do have some conservatives, but it just seems to me as if it's a left of center country in terms of their sense of social justice and solidarity. So I don't know what too left wing would constitute in this sense, but what is your perception of that?
I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I always think, what would happen if there was a pro-independence party that was right wing? Could it sort of attract the votes that the SNP can't attract, or that the Greens can't attract? But for some reason, there does seem to be this tremendous overlap in Scotland between being right wing or right of centre and being sort of committed to the British states. It's sort of like there's a huge overlap, and so the percentage of right wing voters who are even open to independence is probably quite limited. But I'm sure they are put off by, to the extent they do exist, I'm sure they are put off by the SNP being relatively left wing, but arguably we attract more votes that way than we lose in the other direction.
And what does left wing and right wing mean in Scotland? I mean, I have a pretty good concept of what it means within the UK. Well, if you're talking about the difference between the Labour and the Tories, but I mean, I know that socialism has is more profoundly anchored in Scottish politics, whereas if you people call themselves socialist, whereas they wouldn't do that in the UK. How do you just in the Scottish context, what is right wing compared to left wing, and just help enlighten me on that.
Oh, that's a complicated question. Well, I am trying to, in terms of specific policies.
Yeah, generally. I mean, for example, in the United States, people, conservatives are defined as people that, through a lot of propaganda over the years of people who believe this, who believe in free market economics, who believe in, anti-abortion, who are religious right wing, who are, believe in the Second Amendment. Whereas the left wing, such as it exists, I mean, there isn't really a left in power right now. I mean, both parties are very corporate, but so. I guess it's a kind of a vague question, but I mean, if you meet someone who's conservative, in Scotland, what are they kind of typically like as opposed to someone who's more left wing? I know that's very broad and general, but I'm just trying to get some sense of it.
I'm trying to think. Everything's become sort of bound up with the constitutional debate. Is if you meet somebody who's right wing, they're probably going to be moaning about Nicola Sturgeon and complaining about independence and saying how referendums are so boring. And I mean, that's sort of the conversation you would have, with the equivalent of meeting a Republican gun nut in America, and they'd be going on about guns or about election fraud or whatever. Everything in Scotland is bound up with the constitution at the moment. I'm trying to think how it used to be. I mean, I suppose when I was growing up, I barely even met a conservative. It's like it was like universally. If there were any conservatives, they didn't admit to being conservatives. It was like almost uniformly people were left of centre, expressing anti-Thatcher views or anti-John Major views later on.
As conservatism, is it ideologically? Is it ideological? From what I understand, back in the 50s and before, Scottish conservatism was very tied up with, well, business, entrepreneurialism, but also a certain sense of ethics and decency, which is kind of out the window now. Whereas, certainly since the 80s, all of the think tanks have cooked up this, free market, bullshit, about how and being a conservative is, almost you have to, it's like a religion. You have to believe in quote unquote free market economics in order to be considered a conservative. So I mean, do you perceive Scottish conservatism as being at all ideological, or is it just kind of in opposition to independence and the Constitution?
Yeah, I think sort of back in the day, 50s, 60s, 70s, Scottish conservatism was fairly moderate. It's kind of centrist. Some like George Younger, who was in Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet, but he was a moderating influence. You had to, for Mrs. Thatcher's Secretary of State for Scotland, it had to be a moderate. So there was George Younger, there was Malcolm Rifkin. They were both on the left of the Conservative Party. They were both, Malcolm Rifkin even had a history of being pro-devolution, although he had to sort of scrap that. But they were both on the sort of left of the Conservative Party. So even in the 80s, the Thatcherism was being tempered by a sort of slightly more centrist Scottish office and Scottish secretaries.
Was Michael Heseltine? I know he was English, but does he at least seeing him more recently, he seems more kind of moderate and not as intolerant. I mean, is that the kind of mindset that you perceive of Michael Heseltine?
Yeah, I suppose, Michael Heseltine was in Mrs. Thatcher's cabinet as well. And so that, along with George Younger and Peter Walker and Malcolm Rifkin, these people were the moderates. She actually, amazingly, Mrs. Thatcher did have an awful lot of moderates in her cabinet. And so there was always that sort of tension. But in Scotland, actually, in policy terms, there was a bit of a kind of shielding from Thatcherism, with the one obvious exception of the poll tax, which went in the opposite direction. That was actually introduced in Scotland ahead of the rest of the UK. And obviously that was a kind of pivotal moment which turned Scotland decisively against the Conservatives, and they lost half their seats in 1987. And what I was going to go on to say was that when at the start of devolution, by which time the Conservatives had been wiped out, the Scottish Conservatives had been wiped out in Westminster, they obviously thought about this, and they kind of went back to a kind of moderate stance. David McCletchie, Annabel Goldie. David McCletchie was doing almost some left-wing things like free personal care for the elderly, which wouldn't have gone through if it hadn't been for the Conservatives, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats supporting it, and Labour were opposed to it. So almost at that point, it was like the Conservatives were outflanking Labour from the left. Mm-hmm. And I suppose people became more sort of less hostile to the Conservatives during that period. The hostility of the Conservatives went, but they weren't getting more votes. They were still sort of languishing a bit. Mm-hmm. And so along comes Ruth Davidson, and then she takes this completely different approach, drops the moderate language and becomes just one issue. We're against an independence referendum. The SNP are obsessed with independence referendums. Yeah. And that has worked for them. But I think it's probably worked for them at a cost, because because they have this core support, which is really hyped up by that sort of rhetoric. But then that's fine if you're only trying to get 25% of the vote in an election. But to win a referendum, you need a lot more than 25% of the vote. And if the Conservatives are the face of the no campaign and the other 75% of the population hate them, and it's not an exaggeration to say the other 75% of the population hate them, because they do. You can see that in polling evidence. The Conservatives are extraordinarily unpopular with the vast majority of the population. If a Conservative is as the figurehead of the no campaign, that's a problem for them. They'd be much better off with a kind of cuddly, fluffy sort of Charles Kennedy type figure, if such a person exists anymore.
Okay. And how do you see, and I don't know what polling you may have seen on it, but in terms of Labour support for independence, I mean, the support from because what is it, in the current projections, it's roughly that the Conservatives will have about 25% and Labour around maybe 17%, or maybe that's something of that nature. And and from what you've seen, are most the remaining Labour voters still particularly unionist, or are there a good few Labour supporters that, maybe pro-independence?
I think this is one of the differences actually between panel-based and surveyation. With the sort of panel-based polls that I commissioned and other people commissioned last year, there were an awful lot of Labour voters in those polls who were pro-independence, and that was probably one of the reasons why panel-based were showing better results than surveyation. In the surveyation poll I just commissioned, I think it was about 25% of Labour voters were pro-independence, which is lower than we've seen with panel-based. So there's a bit of a conflict between the different polling companies about that.
Okay. All right. I think that'll be good for this evening. Is there anything you'd like to add before we say goodbye to our audience?
No, can't think of anything.
Okay. All right. Well, okay. Well, thank you, everybody. Wanted to see if there's other. Just one last question. Do you think Boris would use the army against the Scots? I mean, in my own view, I don't think that this would be anything like the Catalan referendum. It's completely different context. I don't see that. I can't see them sending an army. They might choose to ignore it. They may stand and enforce. I really I hope I'm right, but that's the way I see it. The British state and the Spanish state are very different beasts, despite everything that you could think about the British state. Okay. Okay. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much for watching, and I shall be back next week with another guest.